This is day 21 of 30 GIMP tutorials, and today's editing challenge is all about fixing underexposed images, and as always, I have some pro tips for achieving awesome results. So here's the image I'm going to show how to demonstrate fixing underexposed images in GIMP, and then I want to show you how I would edit the original RAW file so you can see the editing challenges between JPEG and RAW, because they will both give you different challenges, and one, the RAW file, hint hint, will give you a better quality image in the long run, because we're kind of limited what we can do in GIMP as far as fixing an underexposed image, because one of the main challenges of underexposed images is the loss of detail in the shadows. And when you shoot with JPEG, it tends to lose more detail in the shadows versus a RAW file. Not only that, but when you go to correct the underexposure by making the image brighter, you bring out the digital noise in the image, and you tend to add more digital noise in the process, as well as digital artifacts, which creates another editing challenge, because we really don't have a true denoise tool in GIMP. We have one, but it's not that great. So in GIMP, with my JPEG image here, the first thing I would do to fix this underexposed image is I would duplicate the layer and make an exposure adjustment. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on the layer name here and rename it exposure. Now before we do that, I just want to show you the histogram for this image here. And I'm going to go ahead and click and pull this tab out and enlarge it so we can actually see this histogram. So this is what a typical underexposed image looks like as far as the histogram goes. So the histogram is a graph of the tonal range of your image. So we have our shadows and our black points on the left, midtones in the middle, highlights and white points on the right, and we have a huge gap right here. So in most images, you want a full range of detail from left to right, but as you can see, there's a gap here. So that means there's information or detail missing in the image. So we need to fill in that gap to fix the underexposure. And when we do, we're going to be stretching this histogram from left to right to fill in that gap, but then we will have additional gaps in between the other points of the tonal range. So long story short, this means you're going to end up degrading the image and having a lower quality image versus an image where you nailed the exposure in camera. So I always recommend trying to get the exposure as close to perfect in camera as possible so you can have a higher quality file and you'll have less editing to do, because there's a lot of things we need to do to fix this underexposed image. I'm going to go ahead and put this tab back inside of here so we can access that after. So the tool that I want to use for adjusting the exposure is the levels tool, and we have a lot of different tools that we can use to adjust the exposure, but for underexposed images I like to use levels, and let me show you why. I'm going to come up here to colors and select levels. So we have the histogram here as well, and we see the gap over here on the right. Now the histogram does look different because we are using a different algorithm, at least I was the last time I used levels. So if yours looks like this and it looks different than this histogram, just click on this icon here and then you'll get the histogram that looks like the one that was in your camera as well at the time that you took the photo. So to fill in the gap, we need to adjust the white point, which is represented by this little marker right here. The other thing we want to do is increase the overall exposure, which I'm going to do first by grabbing this midpoint here and dragging it to the left. As I do, that's going to brighten up the image, but it also lowers the contrast. So when I grab my white point marker here and move it to the left to reset the white point, and in case you're wondering, the white point is the part of the image that is pure white. So I'm going to bring that all the way over to the histogram, the edge of it right here, to fill in that gap, and now we have a better exposed image. The other thing that happened when I adjusted the white point is it helped the contrast, so it's not as flat as it was before. If you want to add a little bit more contrast, you can adjust your black point. You just want to keep in mind that anytime you move the black or the white point into or inside the histogram, like I did here for the black point, you begin clipping detail. So you don't want to go too far, otherwise you're going to degrade your image even more. So for example, if I move the white point over here to the right, all the information to the right of this has just been clipped and I lost all that detail. So that's why I like to place this near or close to the edge of the histogram. You don't always have to close it. Sometimes you may need to bring it a little bit further out if the white points are becoming too bright or parts of the image are becoming overexposed. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. I'm going to grab my zoom tool so we can take a look at this image a little closer. And we can now see the digital noise that was there under the dark shadows. So now we need to try and remove that digital noise because it's kind of apparent now and it's kind of distracting from the overall image. So let's duplicate this layer again and call it denoise. We're going to go under Filters, Enhance, and select Despeckle. Not sure why they called it despeckle instead of denoise, but anyways, this is the last settings that I used right here. So the default is probably somewhere in here. So I've increased the white level all the way to the right and the black level all the way to the left. If we take a look at this box here, we can see the before, so that's the digital noise there, and then the after. So it's kind of removed it, but in essence what it's done is it's taken that noise and merged or blended them together and kind of smoothed it out a little bit so it's not as sharp as it was before. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK to apply that edit. And it looks a little bit better. We have some color banding in here, which is another editing challenge. So we're going to go ahead and zoom out just a little bit here. And what I want to do is I want to work on the white balance of the image because I find the color is a little bit off. It's a little bit too green. And the other thing you may notice here is we have some discoloration here and it kind of looks muddied. That's another effect of trying to fix an extremely underexposed image because there was not a lot of detail in here, and this is what you're left with. Even with the hair here, we can see it's kind of muddy. So the exposure adjustment that I did was probably too much. So one of the things I can do now is I can either start over or I can lower the exposure just a little bit to kind and counter that effect to darken up parts of the image. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go ahead and leave that there, and I'm going to leave the denoise turned on as well. Let's create a new layer from here and let's call it white balance. We're going to go up to colors and select color temperature, and I want to adjust the intended temperature to the left because I find it's just a little bit too warm for my taste. So here's the before and the after. The other thing I'm noticing is there's a lot of green in her skin and her hair here. So I want to bring some of that out and add a little bit of red. I'm going to call this one green adjustment. Let's go up to colors and select color balance. So to add red, I'm going to adjust the cyan red here to the right. Not too much. That might be a little bit too much. I'm going to bring that down to about 1.5. So that's looking pretty good. Now the other thing that I'm noticing is, especially when I'm zoomed out here, I just used Command or Control plus Shift plus J to zoom all the way out. Her eyes are a little bit too dark, and I think it would be better if they're just a little bit brighter. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate that layer, and I'm going to call this one, let's just call it eyes. And I'm going to make a curves adjustment. So I'm going to increase the highlights here, and I'm going to add a little bit of contrast by bringing the linear line in the shadow area here down to make that part of the tonal range darker. Now overall the entire image has been affected, but we're going to remove that edit and then apply it directly to the eyes with a layer mask. So let's go ahead and add a black layer mask to remove that edit. And then we can paint with our paintbrush with white to paint that edit back into just the eyes. How cool is that? All right, so there's the before and the after. So they're a little brighter, not too much. And if you find that your edit is too intense, you can always lower the opacity of that layer to try and tone it down that way. So that's a lot of layers and a lot of edits to try and fix an underexposed image, and we still have some problems with this image, especially in the hair and her arm right here. So overall, there's not much more we can do other than doing targeting with our editing. In other words, doing dodging and burning. So instead of doing the exposure on the entire image, we should have done an exposure just in different parts of our subject. So her face, her arms, and her hair all separately, and adjusting the intensity of that edit differently for each part of the image. That is if you want a higher quality image. Needless to say, that's a lot of editing for an underexposed image, but that's what you're left with in the challenge of underexposed images. Again, I highly recommend trying to get that exposure done right in camera. So now I'm going to switch to GIMP on my Mac here so I can show you the raw edit in GIMP. Now, as you know, we cannot open raw files in GIMP, but if you have a raw editor like Darktable linked to GIMP, you can begin the process of opening the raw file with GIMP, and then when you close the editor, it will then open the file in GIMP for further editing. So I have my raw file of this image on my second monitor here, so I'm going to click and drag it over to GIMP. And once I release, it will then begin opening up Darktable. So this isn't going to be a full tutorial on Darktable. It's just going to be an introduction of how you can edit a raw file and how it will give you a better result versus editing an underexposed JPEG file. If you want to learn more about Darktable, I do have some tutorials on it in my YouTube channel here. So go ahead and check that out. I'll put a link in the description below. So the first thing that happens when you import a raw file into Darktable is it's automatically applying edits, which you can see over here in the history. Now, this is the raw file and these are not my edits. This is just what Darkroom or Darktable is reading from the metadata in your raw file, and then it's applying this information. It's not creating this haphazardly and just doing it for the fun of it. It's actually information it's getting from your camera, so it's your camera that's actually applying these edits. Now I bring that up because one of the things you may want to turn off in this history of edits is the base curve. So watch what happens to the image when I click on orientation. The exposure of the shadows is much brighter and the detail in the hair is much crisper than it was before. So I'm going to turn it off so it's much darker, a lot more contrast versus not having that base curve turned on. So this is a better starting point for fixing your underexposed images versus the JPEG file because we have more detail to work with versus that JPEG file. Even though the histogram shows right here, there's a huge gap here, there's still more information than the original JPEG file. So the first thing I want to do is I want to do some basic adjustments, and I'm going to increase the exposure to the right here. And I think around 1.5 stops is pretty good. Now if I go ahead and zoom in here, we can see the transitions of colors on her arm here are much smoother than they were with the JPEG file. They're not as muddy. The same with the hair. We don't have those color distortions that we had in the JPEG file. We do have the digital noise, but the digital noise tool in Darktable is 100 times better than in GIMP. Now before we get to removing the digital noise, I do need to brighten up this image a little bit by adjusting the black and white points. So I'm going to go to my levels tool here and I'm going to adjust the black and white points to brighten it up and add a little bit of contrast. So now I'm closing that gap. Now take a look at the histogram here. We can see that the histogram really doesn't have any gaps in it. If we go back to GIMP here with the JPEG file and take a look at the histogram again, we can see that the histogram is now filled in from the left to the right, but look at these big gaps in the histogram. All those gaps represent information that is missing, detail not there. That's what causes this part of the image to become muddied like this, because there's not enough detail information in the JPEG file to create a smooth histogram. So let's go back to Darktable here. The next thing I may want to do to improve the exposure is apply a curves adjustment. So I love using the tone curve because it allows us to target our edits within specific tonal ranges of the image. So we have our shadows here on the left, midtones in the middle, and highlights on the right. So if I click and drag up, that's going to make the image brighter. Down, it's going to make it darker. So if I leave this anchor point right here, I can target the shadows and then the highlights are not being affected. You don't want to go too far in this situation, otherwise the colors will become flat and the tone range will become flat as well. So let's take a look at the before and after with that tone curve, and it helps brighten up those shadows a little bit more, maybe too much. I'm just going to bring it down and just do a small adjustment. So one more time just to make sure, and that looks pretty good. All right, let's tackle the digital noise now. I'm going to zoom in here, and we can see all these different colored specks, and that's the digital noise. So I'm going to come up here and type in noise, and we have several different options. So the first one here is for astrophotography. We have a surface blur here. I'm not really sure what that one is. I don't really use it. The two that I use the most is denoise and raw denoise, and that depends on the type of digital noise, whether it's a color noise like RGB colors here, or if it's more of a gray color, and it also depends on the type of camera. So you have to experiment with both to see which one will work best for you. So let's compare these two together real quick. I'm going to click right here to turn on this denoise filter. And as soon as I turn it on, boom, that digital noise is gone. So that actually worked pretty good just with the defaults. I'm going to go ahead and turn this one off, and let's take a look at the raw denoise filter. And that one is a lot more intense, and it removed more digital noise. But what it's also done is it smoothed out the digital noise a lot more, and her skin now is starting to look a little bit unnatural because it's too smooth. So either filter will work for this particular image. I like raw denoise because it gives me more flexibility on where to adjust the digital noise based on how fine or coarse that digital noise is, or the details in the image, and we can increase the smoothness or increase the amount of noise to reduce the smoothness. So all we have to do is drop this midline down. It's going to add some digital noise back, but now the overall image is not as smooth as it was before. So there's the before and the after. We can also target the noise, whether it's coarse or fine here as well, but I think that option right there does a pretty good job. So we do have some additional editing to do for this image. For example, I'd probably brighten up the eyes a little bit and maybe add a vignette and maybe sharpen the image a little bit. Let's go ahead and bring this into GIMP now by closing Darktable. And once you close it, GIMP will do its magic and open the image automatically for you inside of GIMP. So we've already gone over some of the dodging and the burning, and I've done other tutorials on sharpening, so we're not going to do that now. What I want to do is I want to export this file with export as, so you can see the before and after of a raw file versus a JPEG file. I also need to change the file format to JPEG. I'm going to go back into the Windows version of GIMP here. Okay, I'm going to set it to 90. That should be good enough quality for this experiment. So I'm going to grab the file here and I'm going to click and drag it over my document so it's added as a new layer. So here is the raw file and the JPEG file. So this image here is a little flatter than this one. This one has more contrast. But if we zoom in and take a look at the shadow areas in here and compare it to the raw file, we can see that the discoloration in this area is not as prominent as it is here. So for me, I prefer this particular edit of the underexposure because it looks a lot more natural than this one here. I can always come in to this image now and increase the contrast if I find it to be too flat. So let me know which edit you prefer, the raw or the JPEG, and let me know in the comments below. And if you'd like to learn how to fix overexposed images, check out that tutorial there to your left. Thanks for listening and have an awesome day.